So to pick up where we left off, only in very, very recent times, and I want to suggest to you maybe the past 250 years or so, have English speakers taken spelling that seriously and wanted one standardized way to spell things. Well, it's certainly the case that Shakespeare spelled his name in different ways. And in the ancient world, where especially in the Roman Empire, where several languages were spoken, it's not surprising that there'd be many, many different spellings of the same words. So misspellings are the most common type of textual variant. There is a very small group of variants that we would call meaningful and viable, meaning that there's a good chance of the variant being authentic, and we're not sure what the text originally said. But you need to realize that this is less than 1% of all the textual variants. So that means that this very, 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 very small number actually provide any kind of doubt as to whether or not we can ever know what the original said. Let me give you one example. In Mark 9:29, you'll see that the New International Version has, when Jesus' disciples ask him why they were unable to help a man with an evil spirit, he replied, "This kind can only come out by prayer." But if you look down at the King James Version, and he said unto them, "This kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting." So why is there this "and fasting"? Well, the reason is that the King James Version is based on what we call the Textus Receptus, the received text, which had only been compiled about a century earlier, actually less than that, and it was a compilation of several different Greek manuscripts. And at the time, when a guy named Erasmus compiled it, he only had a few relatively new Greek manuscripts from which to construct his Textus Receptus. Whereas by the time the New International Version was translated in the 1970s, we had found many, many older and more reliable New Testament texts. So what happens is there are lots of old texts that we have that say this kind doesn't come out by anything but prayer and fasting. And others say only prayer. So which one's right? Well, if I had to bet, I would say that the NIV is right here. You can see that most of the modern translations do that because the older manuscripts, which tend to be closer to the original, don't have "and fasting. But it could be that Jesus originally said "and fasting." So the question is this. We might, even if we'll never know for sure whether or not Jesus said by prayer or by prayer and fasting, will this fundamentally change anything you believe about God, Jesus, the Bible, Christianity, faith? No. So even though this is a substantial textual variant, meaning there is no doubt in the substance there's a difference, it isn't important to the Christian faith. It won't completely shatter anybody's faith one way or the other if it turns out that Jesus didn't say "and fasting" originally, or he did. Another example is to be found in Revelation 13:18. Now you know that the number of the beast is 666. That's in popular culture enough. But did you know that there are some textual variants that have the number 616? And I know what you're thinking. 616, that sounds like the neighbor of the beast, not the beast himself. But the reason why it's even worth talking about is it just so happens that this is a textual variant we've known about for a long time. First of all, you've got Irenaeus from the early church writing around the year 180 A.D., and he even mentions the fact that in Revelation, John writes about this number of the beast 666 or 666. But he also mentions this: "Some I know not how, so I know not how, have erred, following a particular reading, and have taken liberties with the middle number of the name," so the middle 6, "subtracting the value of 50 from it," so 60 minus 50, "and choose to have 1 decade instead of 6, and so it's a 1, 616, 616. And this I suppose to have been the fault of the transcribers, as is often happens since numbers are expressed by letters. And so that's the case. I'll show you those letters in just a moment. But even Irenaeus says, look, in his day, and this is in the 2nd century, look, I know that there are some manuscripts out there that say this, but it should be 666. Now, we knew that Irenaeus said this. We've known this for centuries. But we didn't actually know, we hadn't actually seen any manuscripts that said that. Well, in the 18th century, so Papyrus 115, I'm not talking about that right now, so let me go back to this. In the 18th century, we found a 4th century text of Revelation, and it's a complete text of the book of Revelation. In fact, it's our oldest complete text of the book of Revelation. And guess what? It has the number 616 in it. So you look and say, well, we've known for a few hundred years that Irenaeus mentioned it, and we did have one text that had 616. It just so happens to be our oldest complete text of the book of Revelation, but still, it's dated somewhere around the 4th century, so not going to get too worked up over it. But then in the 1930s, a guy is going through various papyri in the Rylands library. Let's see, where do I want to go here? Now, this is at the University of Oxford, and he comes across what we call P115. And he recognizes this tiny little, maybe the size of a business card, swatch of manuscript has its number. It's of the copy of Book of Revelation, and here it is, 616. And see how they, just like Irenaeus said, they use letters. So the thing is, this Papyrus 115 dates to the 2nd century. So check this out. Now, our oldest complete copy of the book of Revelation has 616, and our oldest fragment from the 2nd century mentions 616. So you see that even though we all just assume it must be 666, there is a chance that it was originally 616. Now, I realize that lots of Christian literature has been written on this subject on in the Left Behind series, and they make a big deal out of this number 666. And a lot of that would have to be rewritten if it's 616. But here's the thing. Again, what if it was 616? Would that fundamentally change what you believe about God, Jesus, what you believe about heaven or hell? No. There's nothing at stake here fundamentally for the Christian faith. So even though this is a substantial textual variant, and most scholars will say, no, we should still use 666. Even though it's a substantial variant, it's not fundamental to the Christian faith. Of course, that's not what you get when you read the Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code, they'll even say that Jesus didn't even proclaim himself as the Son of God. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea, at the result of a relatively close vote, and of course that's from the 4th century. But that's complete bunk, because it's the Gospel of John that says from 175 AD we have P66, so Papyrus 66 has the opening of the Gospel of John. It can be dated to 175 AD, and of course John starts with a very lofty statement. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So we have a manuscript that says that in 175 AD, even though, Dan Brown says it wasn't until the Council of Nicaea, which was almost, not quite, 2 centuries later, that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God by a council vote, which is ridiculous, because John told us this. Of course, he wrote in the late 1st century, but we even have a copy of his writing from around 175 AD, give or take. Now, we can't date it that specifically, but somewhere in the late 2nd century, we can be confident that this was written. And that is why even Bart Ehrman, while he's dithering on various subjects, admits in the addendum to Misquoting Jesus, when they provided certain questions, the publisher did, and he answered them, he admits this. So they ask, why do you believe that these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you described in biblical manuscripts? And Ehrman says, essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. So Ehrman himself admits this. Now, I've got a couple minutes left, and so what I'd like to do is go back and clean up a couple of things that I've mentioned here. This Papyrus 115 was only very recently discovered. So I want to say 1997, but it might even be in the early 2000s that this was discovered. So this is where the other instance of 616 in Revelation. I did want to talk to you about the Rylands Library. So this was so you saw this earlier when I flipped through it. And I want to come back and talk to you about Karl Gottlieb Bretschneider. So in 1844, German biblical scholarship had become what we would consider very liberal and very skeptical of any of the early claims of the first Christians about the authenticity of their works. And he determined that the Gospel of John was written around the year 170 AD. Now you realize if that's the case, obviously it wasn't written by an apostle. In fact, it wasn't written by anyone who lived within 100 years of Jesus. Closer to 150 years of Jesus. So they couldn't possibly know anything directly about the life of Jesus. Well, as you might expect, a lot of people were upset and said, look, what are you saying about inspiration if the Gospel of John, well, it wasn't written until late in the 2nd century? And somehow Bretschneider still believed that you could be a Christian and believe this, but he couldn't really explain how it was we could have any confidence in our Bible if this is the case, if the early church could be fooled by a document that was written over a century after the fact. Well, it was in the 1930s, and this is the document I was talking about in the Rylands Library in Oxford, England, that C.H. Roberts came across this fragment, and he realized it had writing on the front and back, and realized that he had the portion of the Gospel of John. And he knew it was really old. And so he sent it around. He had 3 different experts weigh in on the age of the manuscript. And the Rylands fragment, called P52, is dated somewhere around 125 AD. Now, if we assume the Gospel of John was written somewhere around 90 AD, when John was an old man, then this would put the time span between the original and the oldest fragment of a copy we have somewhere around 35 years. So you realize this gap is getting shorter and shorter. The more manuscripts we find, the closer we're getting down to the originals. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to find the originals, but I just want to point out that every manuscript we find that's a little closer gives us a little more confidence in this. And that's why even though we are further ahead in time, we're farther away from the events than the King James translators were, we're actually in a better situation because we have access to manuscripts that those King James translators could never have seen. And they didn't know about in their time. And so, Lord willing, in the future, we'll have access to more manuscripts. So we're invariably going to have more textual variants. That's only going to make us have more confidence in what we have in our New Testaments, not less. So, to finish up, Bart Ehrman is one of the foremost textual critics in the world. And he seems to really get a kick out of attacking traditional Christianity. Now, he'll say he doesn't have an axe to grind, but it's clear that he does. And I would suggest to you that because he admits he used to be an evangelical Christian and lost that faith, it's important to him that other people lose their faith as well. So when you read Bart Ehrman, realize he is a great scholar and knows a lot about ancient manuscripts, and certainly would know more than I about that. That doesn't mean that the framework through which he views the Bible is correct. And in this sense, Bible scholars don't have a leg up on the average Joe on the street, because ultimately, how you approach the Bible is going to affect what you get out of it as much as what you do with it once you see it. This concludes this week's lecture.